Welcome back to the Integral Stage. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is your one-stop shop for getting to know the most interesting, diverse, brilliant, stupid, sometimes even dangerous and offensive people and ideas across the extended liminal web of integral, metamodern, game B, spiral dynamics, parallaxian, Vervaekian, Henrikian, Bildungian, intellectual, deep Webbian. You know the list. But when I say one-stop shop, if you think about it, it can't really be a one-stop shop. I mean, it can't include literally everything. We're incomplete. There are some things you won't find here. And where are those things? They've got to be somewhere else. And what's that somewhere else like? I don't know, but it sure as hell ain't the same as the integral stage. It's the absence of the integral stage. And how is the incompleteness of the integral stage related to whatever is the absence of the integral stage in a way that makes us be the integral stage? That's the kind of thing or non-thing we're going to be looking at today as we take a deep dive into self-relating negation. And you know, folks, as a Canadian, which is to say someone who's not really American and not really European either, I'm very sensitive to the insufficient appreciation of so-called continental philosophy in our shared discourse spaces. I think there's still a lot to learn from opaque, nuanced weirdos like Deleuze, Badiou, Nietzsche, Hegel, Lacan. These thinkers, if that's the right word, have some very deep swimming holes in their backyards. And the standard university and pop cultural discourse around them is not only typically low grade, but it's full of imprecisions that seem to contaminate even a lot of the discussions in the emerging meta communities. 10 years ago, I wrote an article claiming that Slavoj Žižek is an unacknowledged, non-systematic integral level thinker. I think I described him as a pig truffling around in the cultural soil for postmodern patterns of meaning making. And I think of that fondly. So today we'll be getting down on all fours ourselves to put our own snouts in the dirt with Cadell Last to talk about Žižek's understanding of Hegel, and specifically the issue of self-negation, which could and probably should play a much more central role in the clarification of the new thought spaces and even the new spirituality. So here to discuss the varieties of self-relating negation and to help me stop wondering if he's really Cadell Last, it's Cadell Last. Hi, Cadell.
That was fantastic. That's definitely the best introduction I've ever had. I haven't had too many, but thank you for having me on.
Yeah, this
happy to be with the integral stage.
I feel like we should ceremonially sniff and touch our noses and pluck our shirts while shaking our heads.
Yeah, poor guy. Apparently, it's a tick, you know.
Well, enjoy your symptoms.
Yeah, enjoy your symptom. Exactly, enjoy your symptom. Yeah. That's what I'm still trying to learn from Žižek, and that whole school is this perspectival shift on the symptom.
Yeah,
you know, like it's so like I'm just like in here just let's as an example of self-relating negativity, still like in myself, you know, messing around intellectually with this knowledge for so long. And sort of, you know, daring to take it seriously, I think is the right way to say it, especially coming from a background in science and a background in evolutionary thinking primarily. This perspectival shift on the symptom is something that is still emotionally difficult. You know, like I catch myself all the time sort of like a repressive mind state.
Yeah.
In regards to whether it's like eating or sexuality or you know, just little ticks where there's like this image of the perfect body, or like these little ticks where there's this image of the perfect state, and like I just have this, you know, this then repression kicks in, like, you know, in this image of a future being of myself where this symptom is gone.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's got these two, you know, from my point of view around spirituality and development and things like that. There's two things that are precluded in the rejection of the symptom. And one is your ability to inhabit yourself and actually be present. And the other one is the transformative capacity that might arise by enabling it. You know, Gurdjieff used to say that if you change the pattern, then you're not there present to understand the pattern. We're always in this trap of deviating from the thing that we need to be learning from in order to transform. So our idea about how we could become without that symptom is an obstruction to who we actually could be growing through that symptom.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what's at stake. And I like actually that you reference Gurdjieff, because I've actually right now I'm teaching a course on Hegel, and one of the students in the course who has this one-on-one session with me is a student of Gurdjieff. And I've only, like, I basically know of Gurdjieff through Osho, but like there's this commonality we're picking up in our one-on-one session together of sort of the role of negativity, or the role of, like, the way he talked about Gurdjieff was like almost like getting punched, metaphorically, like with your identity and having it shatter.
Yeah.
But like there's this way in which and I think why that shattering is necessary is because there's this way, and Osho also has a similar idea of, like, you have to shake yourself clean constantly. Like, it's not like this thing that's going to end. Like, you just have to constantly shake yourself, like the dynamic meditation. But like there's this way in which, in order to be present with the symptom, you have to prevent your ego from forming this crystalline perfection, which is actually the opposite of actually dealing with the deviation, and sort of being present with yourself as a deviation. And I take that as also something that's very much a feature of the philosophical tradition that I'm involved with.
Other than these questions around the symptoms status, what is it that you love about Zizek and fear that we would significantly lose if we didn't include more of those kinds of ideas and thinkers in our discourse? What's at stake here, and what attracts you to a guy like Zizek? Because I know there's a lot of people in our discussion spaces that are not at all drawn to him, whether it's his presentation or it's his idea set, or whether it's something deeper than that they want to sort of exclude. It's clear that a lot of people don't tune into a stream like that, and you do. So why is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, all I can say about, like, on my personal orientation to deciding to take him seriously was honestly sort of like this. It was around the time I was starting my doctorate, and it was actually around the time I had just gotten into psychedelics as well. So I was pretty open.
Sure.
But I was just watching some of his presentations, and I think I watched one of his documentaries. And I was just aware that I was interested in communism. I was interested in political theory. I was interested in thinking new social organization. I was just aware that he was capable of thinking in ways that I wasn't capable of thinking in. Like, it was like the form of his thinking was capable of pointing things out that triggered me. And maybe it was because I was so open. Maybe it was a combination of a lot of things. Like, I had already decided when I started my doctorate, because I was sort of lucky to get a grant, which was allowing me a space of a lot of freedom, that I was going to read him without any defensiveness, and I was going to read him with an open mind, and I was going to take a chance. And the deeper I got into specifically what I consider his masterworks, Less Than Nothing and Absolute Recoil, which for me are his most serious philosophical works, the more I saw that what was at stake was a perspectival shift on the one. To put it in its like most simplest terms, like, I feel like there's this very naive way in which abstraction can form a oneness, and identify with this oneness. And there's a way in which what ultimately gets mobilized in the tradition of thought that Zizek works with is this dimension of negativity, and you could say the self-relation to negativity. And the more I played with this little mechanism of self-relating negativity, the more I saw my thought was capable of moving in a very interesting way. So I think what's at stake is like I would say like a matured relationship to the self, and I would say a capacity to mature one's thought beyond a reified abstraction of the one. Yeah.
That strikes me as beautiful, but don't let Alexander Bard hear me use that word.
Right. No, let's get rid of beautiful. No, beauty.
When I was in high school, I wrote a long, surrealistic kind of cut up novel based on the structure of the tarot deck and this weird idea I had from a dream that Leonardo da Vinci and Marcel Duchamp were the same immortal being. And there were pictures. And I remember drawing this picture of two stick figures pointing at each other and shouting at each other. And the one points at the other and says, "Hey, that's not me." And the other one points back at him and goes, "That's not me either." And it always struck me as funny how much those two figures had in common. And I guess this might lead into self-negation because self-negation, self-related negation, it's one of those concepts like non-duality or my work on the metaphysics of adjacency, where a lot of people, even very smart people, kind of shut off when they hear it. It sounds paradoxical, abstract, indulgent, maybe even impossible. It's so different from our usual discussion around cognition that people struggle to treat it as an actual thought. Right? It turns off Noam Chomsky immediately. So, help out the people who are listening. When you use words like negation, self-related negation, what in the nine hells of Cthulhu are you talking about? What do these words point towards?
Well, where to start? So so the simplest way to describe it, I think, is for a lot of European history, but I don't think it's wrong to say world history either. There's this notion of the one, or there's this notion of God, or there's this notion of absolute as the one. I think it also shows up in India. I think it also shows up in China in a different way. But there's this notion of the one. What I think is at stake in self-relating negativity is understanding the one as a historical process. So instead of understanding the one as like a trans-historical or a non-historical absolute being, you understand the one as a processual historical phenomenon. And I think that has the most important thing that is at stake in thinking about the one as a historical phenomenon, to me, is the way we think about the role of the subject in libidinal economy, or the phenomenal history of the subject in sexual dynamics and political dynamics. Because I think where the one is smuggled in, even in the world which apparently God is dead and there's no more God, or there's no more the one, is I think it appears in our sexual spaces and our political spaces. Like, I know for me, in the history of my intimate life, the one was the most important thing in shaping my becoming. And also the one in terms of political spaces is something we're constantly looking for unity. Constantly looking for unity on various levels, whether that's unity of, like, for example, the unity of metamodernism, like the unity of theoretical physics, the unity of Canada, right? Very practical. Mm-hmm. To me, ultimately, it's very practical because it's a metaphysics that includes the self-relation to the one. And so the self-relation to the one has a negative dimension, namely that the one is impossible, the one is paradoxical, it's not something that you can either strictly identify with, and it's not something that you can deconstruct. So something that you can strictly identify with would be the traditional one. So like, I had many debates with Christians when I was growing up, and they would have this traditional notion of the one. And what I don't like in the traditional notion of the one is the way in which the historical subject is absent. Like, they're not there. There's this absolute one, and they have some sort of knowing of it, but all the mess of their libidinal political dimension is absent. Whereas in the deconstruction of the one, so like, say, like, for example, postmodern tradition, whatever you want to call deconstructive mode of thinking, and there's like basically there's bodies and language games, but there's no God, there's no absolute one, is that you fall into like a multiplicity, which I think is very childish. And I think that first I would start with sort of like an analysis of the way in which a lot of people approach polyamory in sexuality is kind of like a naive multiplicity, which sort of just throws the one out, and then you fall into all sorts of affective problems. And I think that that's a problem. And then in terms of like politics, I think you run into a lot of problems with like anarchist political organizations where there's a lot of problems about leadership. There's a lot of problems about masculinity. There's a lot of problems about, boundaries and borders. So like, to me, all this is very practical, is that including the dimension of self-relation, basically what it boils down to is that your thinking has to go against the pleasure principle, meaning that you have to think the parts of your identity which are not working, the negative dimensions of your identity. And to be able to keep thinking that, like I'm talking about like in day-to-day life, like me and my partner like didn't get along well today and she was silent for several hours. Like that's self-relating negativity. And how do you handle that? Like very practically, like, or like, for example, I don't like my boss at work, or I don't know how to deal with the power dynamics of my boss at work, or like, I don't know how to renegotiate my salary, or I don't know if I'm being taken advantage of it in this particular job situation. Like all of these to me are dimensions of self-relating negativity, and like the capacity to mature one's own consciousness in these spaces, to be with this, like, and, or like or it can even go even deeper to the basic drives. So like, for example, in Freud, the basic drives are related to oral drive, genital drive, anal drive. Like these are the basic, and then the drives now you have mature drives on the level of vision and voice. So like what we're doing right now is very mature, like vision and voice, like listening carefully and picking up sharp distinctions and whatever, looking at each other and so forth. But like on the level of like for example, like my most intimate dimension of self-relating negativity would simply be my relationship with food. So this is to me, it's very practical, very intimate, but I also can see why it is also, to me, it's not like I could teach a course on this, but like there's still a dimension of it that is so emotional that it's like, and I don't know, it's a tricky thing to think as well, like there's something tricky about it. Yeah. I can't quite even though like I've spent a lot of time with the literature, like there's something tricky about the thinking, like it's not, I don't know if it's like if it's non-linear or something like that, or if it's like it feels like slippery thinking, because like maybe that's why you were joking about Zizek being a thinker or something like that, because it's slippery, like it's like, yeah, it's constantly moving because yourself is constantly moving.
It in itself seems to embody the characteristic that it points to, right? Like the trickiness seems to be an irreducible component of it. When
that's what Lacan said.
Yeah. When I talk about the metaphysics of adjacency, in a way, I'm trying to put slipperiness as the fundamental building block of conceptions of reality, rather than things that seem to stop the slipperiness. Because it seems like if you're honest and you go down and have a look at, no matter how fundamental the units are, they're always contextualized, and they're always problematic, and they're always challenged by something that's embedded in their own structure. There's a question that came up for me when you were saying that stuff, because there's a lot about, taking the concept of oneness in its greatest and its simplest sense, and making that be more temporal and more heuristic and more problematic. And do you think that is itself a historical process? Are we just starting to do that? Did it come about with Hegel, or have there been people all along who've been able to get to that place?
So that's a great question. That's actually like basically like that's similar to a framing that I'm using in my Hegel course, is like trying to understand, like, because some people will like ask me like what is it about Hegel that differentiates him from other metaphysicians like Spinoza or a Plotinus or Plotinus or a Plato or whatever, like, and like I think it has something to do with Hegel's historical position in relationship to the birth of the modern political world. You know, like there's all these stories about Hegel's observations on Napoleon in the times of the aftermath of the French Revolution and so forth, and like the birth of like new political thinking about the modern world and so forth. And in that sense, like I tend to the view that the one has always been a historical process, but that it's actually like something that humans are just really cluing into. And like to give an example like that, like when we like Zizek will always give examples of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and he'll always emphasize the Haitian Revolution. So like the reason why I think he like includes the Haitian Revolution is because he wants to emphasize that this is not European universality, that it's a universality that happened to have appeared in Europe. That's contingent though. And that like immediately the same form of universality was translated into basically an African diaspora population. And the same logic, and like the Hegelian tradition transitions into the Marxist tradition. And Marxism also had this universal appeal well beyond European borders. Like it influenced, well, of course, Russia, China, but also many African and South American states as well. And it had basically global appeal as like a symptom of capitalism. And not saying that I'm not at all saying that's a positive, like that Marxism became a positive political project, merely saying that the idea had a universal appeal, that there was a type of self-relation, I would say like a self-relationship to the one. Like that, like it's no longer like, it's like no longer are we thinking about the one outside of subjective historicity. We're thinking about the one inclusive of subjective historicity. And I think that, like, for example, when you take, for example, a theoretical development like emerged with the Frankfurt School, I think they also saw that this subjective historicity went deeper with the introduction of Freudian psychoanalysis, because then we're dealing with now, so like they put Freud and Marx together, like tried to put them together. And I think that's on the level of like, the self-relation is down to you and your own dreams. Like not just you and the political structure, but you and your own dreams. And so it's like this, I do think that there's a way in which we can frame this as an increasing awareness or increasing consciousness of the absolute. Possibly. I mean, yeah, I honestly obviously don't know, but like that's the way I would think about it.
I spent a lot of time in religious circles, and I can imagine a broad-minded monotheist imagining that what's being discussed here is a deeper merger of God and the world. So that, right, and that the structure of the increasing depth of that merger is some kind of paradoxical slip past, the self-relating negation move, and that's going to become more and more obvious as the form of the one and the form of the world become the same form. So that's a very nice story. But on the other hand, it presupposes that we already imagined the one existing and being capable of that. Right? Is that problematic, or could a person tell themselves a useful mythos like that?
So like for me, like and this also like relates to like I want to state also that like even though I was pulled into this critique of the Gamby initiation video with Bart on the Stoa, the only real main thing I wanted to say, and like the only thing that like was at issue for me with the video, because I'm not at all like against, like I'm not against Gamby or metamodernism or anything like that, and I don't want to give off that vibe, but like the only thing that's at stake is that the structure of ideology to me is this fall from a one and a return to a one. And that appears in many stories, like, and that can take many forms. And like, I mean, I think that appeared even in Marxism. And I think that's even like the flaw in Marxism is like this idea of primitive communism and this return to world communism. I think that's a flaw in the thinking structure. So like, I think that what's at stake is in thinking about self-relating negation is keeping one with the present moment of the slipperiness and the paradoxicality of the one, without telling one a story that one has fallen from a one and one is returning to a one. And so like that, I mean, that's the simplest way I could describe it. I think what's at stake is this staying with the paradoxicality of the structure. And that requires constantly thinking afresh and constantly thinking new things, because obviously your abstraction is riddled with negativity because it's not the one. Like it's like, I'm just realizing I'm writing a paper right now with Thomas Hammerich, who's in the computer science department at University of Copenhagen. And I'm realizing this relationship between abstraction and negativity has very concrete examples for technological progress, because like we're talking about this paper called the abstraction explosion. And like, there's this basic sense in which like abstract, what's at work is there's a general abstraction. This is always what's the risk, at least in my view, is that like there's this general abstraction, which could be a computer program or it could be a story of the one. Like it could be a mythos or it could be like a technical logos, to use these languages. And by definition, it's not all, meaning that there's going to be problems with the abstraction. There's going to be things it misses. And that's where the subject needs to stay thinking. It needs to stay alert. And to make that abstraction more concrete means that it needs to be more specified to the singularity of that person's historical moment. So I guess like basically these stories, or these, whether it's a computer program or whether it's a theory, like any type of physics theory or any type of scientific theory, or whether it's a mythological story or whether it's a religious narrative of some kind, what's at stake in self-relating negativity is not over-identifying with it to the point where it takes your attention or awareness away from the paradoxicality of the experience of your present moment.
This seems very applicable, very germane to spiritual practice, in that it seems like a clarification or a specification of mindfulness, of presence, of a way to do that avoids a certain psychoanalytically predictable error that might normally crop up in a person's attempt to be present adequately. And thinking about spirituality and presence leads me to think about Ken Wilber, because his version of integrative philosophy emphasizes Hegel as a great big picture history thinker who produced transdisciplinary phenomenology that situates philosophy and culture in an evolving tale of world and spirit. All this kind of stuff Ken Wilber loves in his narrative. And he's particularly drawn to this Hegelian Aufheben, which is a very nebulous German word that suggests, I don't know, whatever undermining and going beyond and becoming a part of and lifting and canceling and absorbing and triumphantly surrendering all have in common. Wilber connects that to his idea of transcend and include. And I guess as much as Deleuze might set up Nietzsche sometimes as the anti-Hegel, it seems very consonant with something about the intrinsic self-overcoming that characterizes the world as the will to power. So I'm curious, what is it for you? How do you go about feeling into and contemplating the Aufheben?
Yeah, I mean, so like, I think like the most common English word that's used for this term is sublation. Mm-hmm. The way I've related to it, so like I'm also doing on my YouTube channel, I'm also doing a Return to Freud, which is basically going back to the original Freudian text and like just trying to analyze what significance some of the ideas still have for thinking about contemporary psychology or psychiatry or whatever. And the term that comes out to me the most when I read his writings is sublimation. So basically I connect as like a way to work with one's libidinal energy without repressing. And so like I basically connect the notion of sublation or Aufhebung as this lifting and canceling with the notion of sublimation. And it's again sort of connected to the way in which this historical process of the one moves from a political determination to also a libidinal economic determination. Like, we have to include our historical bodies, like, and the intimate dimension of our bodies in thinking about political organizations. So basically, I guess like the closest thing I could say is that the way I relate to it is with the process of sublimation, which is sort of lifting up. It's at the same time a lifting up and a canceling of sexual energy, but in a very sort of art, like, and then to connect that to Nietzsche, it's in a very artistic dimension. How I would and I am in like my work with Bart, I am trying to connect, I'm trying to rethink this narrative that Deleuze sets up as Nietzsche's the anti-Hegel, because we could go into it in a little bit of detail, but like the crucial thing, or one of the crucial things for me, is that when Hegel thinks about the absolute, he's thinking about religion, philosophy, and art. And Nietzsche's thinking, Nietzsche keeps on reaffirming that he wants a life-affirming artistic philosophy. And I think that we need to be able to think the triad of art, philosophy, and religion again in a Nietzschean frame. I think there's too much anti-religiosity in Nietzsche's thinking, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It obviously hit a nerve, and I think it spoke to something real. But I think what he's ultimately saying is that if you do not have absolute knowing in Hegelian language, if you don't have absolute knowing, or in Nietzschean language, if you don't have some social relationship to the overman, then your religious idea will fall apart. Like, it will become empty. It will become an empty abstraction. Like, religion will become an empty abstraction. Philosophy will become an empty abstraction. Art will become an empty abstraction. If you don't have some social way to connect the various levels of the social order with absolute knowing or the overman or something like that. And I think that that's telling in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is that Zarathustra stays in the cave. Like the fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra annoys me, because the first three parts I love. And then the fourth part, he's just in the cave gathering some of his friends for a party in the cave. And it sort of ends like that. And I think that that's sort of where I would like to take Zarathustra. Is I would like to see, what is it possible for a Zarathustra? Is it possible for these types of beings to be a source of inspiration and creativity in society instead of away from?
When you were talking about that relationship to absolute knowing or to the overman, of course, I thought of Kierkegaard's relationship to Christ, which leads me to the question for you. What do you think Kierkegaard thinks is lacking in Hegel?
Yeah, so the common, I think, story is that Kierkegaard thinks that Hegel's idea of the concept, or the idea, it's a similar critique that I hear people say about Plato, which is that their concept of the concept, or their concept of the idea, doesn't leave enough room for thinking subjectivity, or in like Kierkegaardian language, for a proper understanding of existential condition, our existential condition. Maybe this like, and this is like in Less Than Nothing, in Zizek's Less Than Nothing, he'll constantly set up this relationship between the straw man of Hegel and the iron man of Hegel. And the straw man of Hegel is this idea that his idea of the concept is this sublation which eats everything. You know, like a sublation which has no room for otherness, or has no room for like singular individuality, let's say. So like, I think what Kierkegaard's pointing towards is this, and like connected to Christ, and thinking here about Christ as a figure, like Kierkegaard connected to Christ is this irreducible singularity, like this irreducible singularity which has no room for generality. Like it's your singular existential. And so like, that's how I would understand like the birth of existentialism. I mean, I think the tradition running from Kierkegaard also can like point towards the birth of the 20th century phenomenologists and figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and things like that. But like, there's this way in which the straw man of Hegel, there's no room for singularity. And that's a weird thing. And that's an unfortunate thing, because the actual triadic logic that I think is overlooked in some of Hegel's writing is the relationship between universality, particularity, and singularity. So it's like it goes from like a universal abstraction to a particular individual to a concrete singularity. And like the concrete singularity, I think is how also Hegel would think Christ.
It's strikes me as very Hegelian to look for the essence of Hegel's thought in the particular anti-Hegelian existentialists.
I think, So go ahead.
No, I was just, there's something about emotion and mood that comes up for me around this, right? There's a certain dispositional quality of a willingness to be related to the ultra peculiarity of the individual circumstance. And that's not just an idea, it's something we have to be emotionally capable of, because a lot of people recoil from that quality. And when I'm thinking about the role that moods play in this, I come to what you mentioned a few minutes ago, the current debate around the Game B experiment at doing an introduction video. And I have a lot of complex ambivalence around that. Right? On the one hand, I have no problem with people specializing in positive affect and marketing and sacrificing personal exploration time to try to think out systems that might be able to outperform our current system, Schmachtenberger. But clearly there's as much or more urgency in terms of having people living together, living through experientially integrating shadow, antagonism, sexuality, the imbalance of energetics, excluded or hidden logics that undermine our attempts to be positive, practical, and reasonably cooperative individuals. So it seems like an authentically transformed biocultural civilization that we all hope for has to not only take into account the nice things about civilization and ecosystems, but also has to incorporate rather than dismiss or ignore or replace things like the predatory elements of mating, the competitiveness that underwrites collaboration, the dystopian dynamics that might play within an actually improved socio-technological arrangement. So it seems like that what is not happening as much as it should. Certain forms of psycho-emotional immaturity are combining with certain forms of the marketing culture to create, even across the liminal web communities, persistence of game A or first-tier consciousness in the form of a bland, equalized, omnipositive, castration-haunted ethos that could become very popular, but replicates the shadow of oppressive game A dynamics that it purports to challenge. So I guess the question is, how do the insights of a Hegel or a Zizek help us to preserve enough chaos and pathos to actually give birth to dancing stars, while we are still going about the serious work of trying to correct our particular economic, technological, and political dynamics?
What was the last part? The give birth to dancing stars and the other thing?
Yeah, so like how does this thinking, Hegel and Zizek type thinking, how does it preserve enough chaos and pathos to give birth to a dancing star? Well, we are still doing that Schmachtenberger work of trying to think out and correct the systems we live in.
Yeah. I mean, big questions. I mean, it's like one of the things about Hegel's cunning of reason is not like he's not like deifying the individual rationality. Is he's saying there's like a larger social reason, like that individuals are not aware of, and like there's a social logic to movement which individual egos are blind to. And I think that this like paradoxically applies also to the way Marxism actually was enacted concretely. So like the paradox of you try to assert your freedom, like let's all build it. Like it's not, I mean, like we have to look at like last 200 years about how this desire to go from like game A to game B is not a new impulse. It's a different language for an impulse which has been in us for centuries of like, let's form a socialist world, let's form a communist world. And then paradoxically you end up in totalitarianism. Like, so you want one thing and then you get the other. you want freedom, you get slavery. So like I think there's a way in which we have to be careful about recognizing that there are large scale social forces which no one understands really. And that comes with a certain humbleness. And at the same time, like, I don't necessarily want to say that we should just go to like this more, you know, like clean your room sort of attitude, you know, like make your bed sort of attitude. I almost want to approach this, I guess, dialectically. But what I see in the, like, what I see in the current space that you're articulate, like the current space that you're framing, is that there's a way in which good intentioned intellectuals can still be unaware of how deep the unconscious is, of how deep the problem goes, and that's why I would bring it back to self-relating negativity. Is like, it is that the problem is a lot more serious than we think, and I like it, and it's a lot darker than we think, and like, I'm not saying that, like, it's not like I'm saying that because I want to say that. I'm not saying that because this is like if we could have like a perfectly functioning game B world where like there was higher order collaboration, and like I could situate my intellectual career within a community that like recognize me, and I could recognize other people, and like, and it could be smoother, and I could escape like sort of certain, you know, institutional dynamics which are toxic and stuff like that. I would love all that stuff. It's just that taking into consideration the reality of the human being requires a lot more thinking about our fundamental core motives, and those fundamental core motives are fundamentally involving pretty intense drives related to, in my view, eating, fucking, and killing. Which, if they're not saying like, so like, what's that like? So here's what I'll say. Like, this is what I want. One of the things I wanted to say to you, because I've been thinking a lot about this, because one of my biggest challenges in the IDW has been sort of the relationship between my thinking and Girard's thinking. And of course, Girard is basically saying here, like, fundamentally, we like, the origin of society is violent, and that's the truth upon which the lies of society are built on. And like, what the only place I can come in thinking about this is that we have to, hopefully this will be interesting. We have to work with the deepest dimensions of our eating, our fucking, and our killing drive, to the point where we internalize our true knowing of ourself, which will include the death of our ego. Like, that to me would be true ego death. True ego death would be really understanding the core motives of those drives. And like, the three examples I can think about those drives that appear in the specter of our current society. The first is pornographic film. Like, the degree to which, like, pornographic film as a virtual representation, and not just pornographic film, very broadly, the way in which contemporary social media is hypersexualized, like whether it's like Instagram, whether it's TikTok, whether it's like all these little virtual tics that people develop, whether it's dating apps and stuff like that. That's really like pulling people, and like, people are really stuck to these surfaces in this way. The second thing is people's obsession with like horror movies, killing movies, serial killer movies, or like documentaries about those types of phenomena. Like, that's also very viral. Like, if you look up online, like documentaries or like movies which have a theme that's roughly about like some killing urge, some killing impulse, or like, you know, like Dexter or something like that, broadly speaking, or like Like there's a lot of, for example, documentaries and Netflix films about like, I don't know, like Ted Bundy and stuff like that. Like that sort of virtual fixation that people have. And then the third thing is like, I guess, well, this one is not so much a cultural phenomenon, but it's like these movies where people are pushed to the limits of not eating. Like there are some movies where people are really pushed to starvation or pushed to like the zero level of not eating, and like what actual emotions come out in those spaces. So like, to me, those things are like the constellation of like, let's say primal virtuality, that like, if we're really thinking about building a new, better society, because the institutions, like the game A institutions contain all those drives somehow. And those institutions are breaking down. And if we want to think of better, different institutions, we have to work with, that's my thought, is that we have to work with what we really are. We have to work with what, and now, what are the types of beings that can work with what we really are? They're the types of beings that have confronted that in themselves first. You have to have been able to confront it in yourself first, then maybe you could work with it outside. And like, before I stop this rant, I was at a European men's gathering in the summer. It's run by Manifesto. Alexander Bard's involved with it, but it's run by a guy named Paul Robeson. There's like 150 guys showing up there for a self-transformative experience. Basically, the experience is that they're going to be confronting their desire to kill the father, and like to like, there's a whole bunch of narratives building up towards experiencing that and sort of processing that energy and so forth. And while we were at that event, there was a guy who was attacked. There was an event where someone was put into a situation where there was an unconstrained pathos, where someone, obviously no one died, but there was a violent situation. And when we're thinking about actually bringing together humans to move through transformative processes towards actual knowing and deep knowing, we are going to confront those things. And the best example I can think of that represents the difference in what I'm trying to articulate versus what I see in the metamodern spaces is the difference that Osho described between his dynamic meditation workshops and the Esalen Institute. You know the Esalen Institute? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there were some leaders of the Esalen Institute that went to go visit Osho and to see the type of work he was doing. And the people from the Esalen Institute basically got triggered and left because Osho was working with these core drives. And this is very dangerous stuff. That's why it's not thought. And I'm not saying that I know the answers. I'm saying the opposite. I don't know. But I think that's what we have to think.
I think it's fairly easy for people to see that as an individual, that this would be really important work, to explore themselves, to understand themselves, to be a rich rather than suppressed being, to be more psychologically conversant with their unconscious drives and patterns. I think there's an interesting way to tell a theological story around this, right? That God's trying to merge or come into the world. And, maybe in the past, God was able to come down only as far as your head, but now God wants to come all the way down and occupy a full body. And so it has to be able to, deity has to merge with fucking and killing and eating. Because that's what's down there. And if it doesn't do that, it won't be able to get land completely in the world. That's a very interesting tale. I'm attracted to that. But in terms of how this looks like at the level of institutional structure, that's a really big question mark for me. I don't know how you set up systems that are analogous to that kind of individual psychological and perhaps even theological incorporation of these elements.
I don't think they would be institutional structures. Like, I don't think they would be institutional structure, but I just want to say, I love the way you describe that, like of the God coming down into your head, then coming, it wants to come all the way down into your body. Like, that's the level of the challenge. It's like, I hadn't thought about it. And like, there's something about the way you said that, yeah, I mean, just something clicked in a different way for me. But in terms of institutional structures, is like I did my PhD thesis on the it's called Global Brain Singularity. And I was at an institute led by Francis Heiligen and a bunch of complexity and evolutionary scientists. that basically talk about like distributed cognition and distributed organizations and stuff like that, and networks and stuff like that. I mean, that's obviously, I mean, a lot of people are talking about that type of thing in complex system science and stuff like that. The thing is that I don't think those very scientists doing the distributed stuff are like themselves, even embodied cognition people, like they aren't themselves embodied. Like, so they know about it. And it's like exactly what you said about the head to the body. It's like, they know about it in their head. Like they probably know about it better than me, but like, they don't know about it like down all the way. And like that, and like, but like my intuition is with these different structures is like, I sense like, again, there's a reason that's not in any one individual, but that is like, but like that transcends my individuality, which if I tap into it and like sense into it, it's like, I almost feel like the way I've been living has been very anti-institutional. Like I was saying to Peter Limberg, I almost feel like, even though I'm not like a game B theorist, like I've kind of like lived a game B life. I'm not in institutions necessarily. And I'm kind of like a nomad, like hopping around, trying to do like these, like most of what I'm doing is like in like some distributed digital network. But like, I think like, if I look at my actual friend network and I think about how my network's evolving right now, like there's a sense in which like, it's not an institution, but I'm kind of being held. Like I'm like, an institution isn't holding me, but something is holding me. Like there are a few cities, a few countries where like I would have a bed to sleep in, for example, like, or like there's a, you know, like there's a few, like there's a few people like who would like conceivably be interesting long-term intellectual partners where like we could build something like an online university or something like that. I mean, but the structure is not like a conventional institution. And I don't know how it will evolve.
It's very difficult to figure out, you know, whether there does or does not need to be some kind of institutional analogy to these processes or not, right? Because being held in a distributed, even in some ways mysteriously subtle ethos or network, that might be great for the philosopher and the artist, but it's difficult to think how we run a nuclear power facility in that manner. Mm-hmm. Right. But we also don't want our nuclear power facility to be contaminated by unrealized shadow elements at the base of human nature. But let's leave that as an open question, because sexuality has come up a few times here. And I think there's some really interesting things that you might have insights on in this area. It's like one thing that a guy like Lacan has in common with ancient esoteric wisdom is this intense attempt to leverage an abstract notion of the masculine and feminine to help us understand human and cosmic affairs. Now, I have a whole series of interviews on sexuality, so I've talked to a lot of people who both do and do not accept the utility of a kind of yin-yang, two-valued sexual couple archetype. But personally, and maybe as a cis hetero male with a beard, I've always been fascinated by the experiment of trying to articulate algorithms of the sexual essences, right? So I've been through a lot of weird permutations of this in my own life. Right? I noticed that men tend to pretend masculinity is simpler and more obvious and more normative than it is. A lot of women pretend that femininity is more obscure, more intuitive, less included than it is. I was sitting at a strip club years ago and noticed that women take their clothes off and immediately leave the stage. So I thought, oh, the masculine feminine dynamic is not trying to see naked women. It wants to see women undressing. That men have built this stage out of nothing so that women can show them what it's like for someone to escape the forms that have been given to package them in. Right. So that's very interesting that the feminine has this sort of eluding or slipping away quality, which also is expressed in things like the question, yes, but what about the women? Or for me, to put it another way, in the sentence men and women, the and goes with the women. There's this linguistic pretense that man simply represents humanity as it did in traditional languaging, and that woman represents the incompleteness of the ability of the male signifier to encompass what it pretends to adequately be. So I'm curious how you feel about the nature of sexual essences and the utility of making abstract structural descriptions of masculine and feminine, and where in that you think negation has its most important role.
Yeah, like this is just fun, man. Like, like so, like how I understand it is like how I understand it is basically that pre-modern cultures, I'm speaking broadly here, but like that pre-modern cultures tried to establish some sort of harmonious duality between man and woman, like yin and yang. Like you might say, like in classical descriptions of the public and the private sphere. Like man has the public sphere, woman has the private sphere. Like I think Camille Paglia will say something like men and women before the modern world, you know, like we underestimate the degree to which women ruled the household. And men had the public sphere, and now, you know, she talks about the problem with the mergers of hierarchies and stuff like that, and we underestimate the degree to which merging the male and the female hierarchy creates a lot of psychological problems in between our dynamics. In any case, how I understand psychoanalysis is that this idea that there's like a dualistic harmony between man and woman is what has to go. And I think like you were pointing towards it in some of your examples, like, but I'll sort of try to tiptoe towards it with the language that I have become familiar with. The first is the basic principle that Freud thought the libido was masculine and it was one. So like, it's not like that there's a masculine libido and a feminine libido. It's like there's a masculine libido and kind of like a lacking other. So like very practically how that works, and the example I think is best that I've used to describe that is on the level of biology, there's sort of like the well-known genetic fact that we're like basically default female and the male is a deviation. So like you have X chromosomes, which are female, and the Y chromosome, which is the male chromosome. And if you look at like all the chromosomes, the Y chromosome is like a weird little chromosome. In Freudian analysis, how I understand it is that it's kind of like the opposite, that we all start out as like little boys in a way. And the reason why we all start out like little boys is because we all want the mother. And we're all in the mother. Like, so it's a very bodily thing. And like we all come out and we want the mother's breast. And the father is some, you know, so there's an asymmetry basically. What I'm trying to say ultimately, there's an asymmetry, which is uncomfortable. Now, how I understand the maturation of the libidinal energy, especially as it relates to the puberty phase, is that it's harder, and this is where I have a lot of sympathy for, like a genuine sympathy for women, is because I feel like how I've heard it described is that it's harder for a human subject to subjectify as a woman than it is for a human subject to subjectify as a man. And the reason explanation I would have is because of the starting condition of the subject is that the boy simply has to switch the transference object. So the transference object goes from primarily the mother to I've got to go on an adventure to find a girl who would date me. And I remember when that transition was happening in my head and like sort of the logic that went along with that transition. Apparently, for the feminine subject, the transition has to be I want the mother to I am the mother, which is an inversion of the energy. Now, it's not a conscious I'm the mother, although little girls will start playing house as like they're I'm the mother and stuff like this. But like the most obvious example is like when women start dressing up their body. So like when women start performing their body as the sexual object, putting on makeup, dressing up. And like, if you look at like, for example, the fashion industries and you look up like the makeup industries, I mean, these industries are enormous. And that's basically the dramatization. It's the masquerade. It's the masquerade that you were pointing towards with the stage. And this masquerade is built out of nothing. That's the point of the, like, it's exactly how you said it. You say men built this stage out of nothing. And then the women will put the packaging on from the male gaze, right? That will sort of get sort of the recognition for a certain sexual being, the sexual object, basically. But there's this way in which woman is more abyssal, in a sense, whereas man is constantly trying to substantialize the woman. So like there's this weird asymmetry between the libidinal energy, which doesn't have an object, and this missing object, which tries to masquerade as the thing. That's how I understand this relationship, broadly speaking. Now, it presents some huge ethical and huge conceptual problems in the modern world, which I don't think that we have started to think properly at all, mostly because it's a topic that's moralized so strongly that it's hard to open up the thinking space for it. That's my feeling about it.
When you think about people whose emerging identity doesn't seem to correlate with classical masculine or feminine, do you think that's more like they're on a spectrum somewhere in between, or they're held in a neutralizing position? Or do you think that the move, like if we all start physically female and psychosexually masculine in a way, and then there's this complexification into the abyssal feminine, is that move continued into the multiplicity of other possible identities, right? If someone says, look, there's actually 64 genders or something like that, are they talking about something between masculine and feminine, or are they talking about something further down that feminine move?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like, so like I like here, like I obviously I don't have like all the answers here, but what I can say is that like I had 2 sets of trialogues with Kevin and Daniel when we were writing Sex, Masculinity, and God. And the second set of trialogues hasn't been published or anything, but where the conversation started to go was we started to find more and more utility with the concept of androgyny. And the concept of androgyny is ancient. It appears in Plato. Like I've actually spent many hours reading Plato's passages on the androgynous creature because I just think it's like it's hilarious and it's fascinating. But it's this idea that there's like a third category, which is neither masculine nor feminine. It's both masculine and feminine. And it's also like somehow contains this raging multiplicity within itself. So I don't 100% know, but like in myself, what like my intuition would be like, because for example, like I've watched a lot of I've watched at least a lot of media that plays with gender. Like, I mean, some of the most interesting is like, for example, like, or some of the most popular, I would say, is like something like RuPaul's Drag Race, something like that, where men are performing as women and stuff like this, and like playing with their gender, playing with their identity. Is that somehow everyone has a masculine or feminine dimension within them. Like Freud would even say, like, we're all bisexual, basically. And it's sort of like the way you're playing with the sexual energy. And I guess I would say, or I would just hypothesize that if you really play around with both the masculine and the feminine dimensions of yourself, the chance that something new, like some third, which is not really categorizable in a general sense, might emerge. So like the best example I could think for this is like Alexa Vartman, who runs the New Tantra, or like was founded the New Tantra, was like he originally was fully exploring his masculine, then got bored with it, and then started fully exploring his feminine, and then became more performatively a she. And now is probably something that, like, properly speaking, can't be categorized. So like the idea I have in my head is like, if you explore the full range of your masculinity and femininity, you might push beyond into a different type of categorization space. The thing is that whole process is extremely effectively disturbing. Like, or can be it can be great too, but there are certain events. Like, for example, I ran a men's circle where actually one person in the men's circle started to decide that he wanted to perform as a woman, like just through basically just through free association, like just through opening up about how he feels. And then just like one day, he starts performing as a woman. But that transition to realizing that involved a disturbing event, like kind of like being shocked from within. That's, I don't know, that's my thought of it. That's where I think
that's interesting to me in terms of the way I've heard Nietzsche talk about repetition in Hegel, because I think I've heard him talk about it in a couple different ways. And one is sort of, something occurs, but it's not really registered in the signification world that we live in until it happens again. Like there's Caesar, but the concept of Caesar isn't really there when just Caesar was there. He had to die, and there had to be a second Caesar for Caesar to be entered into our thinking. And then the other way I've heard him talk about it is the sense that the real change, the real novelty, the real mutations are possible sort of in the depth when it looks like the normal form is repeating, but its meaning has changed. And that interests me in terms of what you're saying, because it seems like there's two different ways for that sexual mutation, let's call it, to go. One is that a person begins to feel and identify and overtly express some condition that is not identified by either of the two binary categories. But the other way is that you can imagine someone going through that same play, and what they end up settling on is something that looks very much like a traditional masculine or feminine role, but now incorporates the ambiguity and the openness and the next level that emerged from that play.
I've
no question there. I'm just curious how you feel about it.
I've seen that, like, so like the two examples you give, I've seen that happen both ways. Like, and like, so what, like, now what I sense in here's what I sense in myself is that I sense that I know there's a dimension of my femininity that I have to explore. I can sense it in myself. I know it's in myself. I can see it in my images. I can see it in my self-relation. I am taking steps I have ideas about how it would look to explore it. My intuition would be that by exploring it, I would actually become a more stable and more mature man. That's my intuition. So it would be like, by exploring the other side of myself, I think I would come back around to something that's actually a much more mature, much more stable masculine. But I could also see, other people experimenting with it in different ways, where they end up playing around with the masculine and the feminine, and then they find themselves in an uncategorizable situation. I think so. That's why I think it could go either way. And I don't know why it would go one way or the other for a certain individual.
Well, let's come back around to Less Than Nothing, right? Interesting title of a Zizek book. You've got a whole internet series on it. Neat concept, and I can see people going different ways with the concept of less than nothing, right? I feel like one way that's kind of common for people to go is there's a primordial nothingness, like the original supersymmetry in physics, and it falls or breaks, becomes less than itself in the creation of the universe, and then the universe is less than nothing, even though Bergson has some interesting things to say about why we can't actually use nothing as a concept. But the other way to think about it is that there's, in addition to all the things, there's something else. And this something else perhaps is more accurately described as nothing, but describing it as nothing still isn't quite as accurate as we can get. We have to subtract its nothingness from it in order to say it more clearly. And that reminds me of the Buddhist dictum that emptiness itself is empty of emptiness. And that, of course, fascinates me, because in my adjacency thinking, I'm always interested in specifying a primordial movement of being itself by not quite being itself. So that's all my nonsense around less than nothing. When you contemplate the spirit of what less than nothing means, where does your thinking go?
Well, like the first thing is that how Zizek describes it is I mean, I don't know if it's identical, but it's much closer to the way you were describing the second example. Whereas it's like this primordial being that is asymmetrical. It can't fully be itself. And that we have to, basically what less than nothing is structured by is a constant subtractive gesture. So like, in terms of like what I would say is maybe a more intuitive way to conceptualize the concept, and the way I've sort of, I actually sent him an email with this concept, which he seemed to like, is the idea of more than something, instead of less than nothing, and like that. But what this concept is trying to get at is basically a relationship between emptiness and virtuality. I mean, that's ultimately how I'm trying to think about it, is like this relationship between like emptiness and fiction, and specifically the dimension of fiction, which is, you could say, more than something, because like it's just vaster than something. It like is in excess of something. But it's kind of like less than nothing in the sense that like it's like, the best example I could give is like avatars of the void, like masks of the void or something like that. So like that's how I understand it. And then another side note, which might be interesting for the listeners, is that the book was oscillating between two titles. Less Than Nothing, and the other title was E per si muove, which is the title of the introduction, which is And Yet It Moves. And so I think the concept of less than nothing can be clarified in some ways with the concept of E per si muove and Yet It Moves, with the idea that basically, even when you go to the zero state of, and he gives this example actually throughout the book, if you, for example, meditate to the point of just an empty consciousness, that it takes more energy to stay in the zero state than it is to move. So in other words, it's simply cheaper to keep moving than it is to stay still. So there's like this self-repelling gap. Like even if you clear out everything and you go to the nothingness, like for example, like there's these examples of like people who go to like dark rooms, like where like they blindfold themselves, or like they're in complete darkness and there's no food and there's nothing at all. It's like you can reach transcendental states in that dark room. But you can only stay in that dark room for so long before you have to reemerge as your identity and like, go back to the world, so to speak. And like, usually what happens when I've listened to like people describe the dark room, it's kind of like you reach this transcendental state, and like you, in the process of reaching that transcendental state, like you have to work through a lot of negative emotions about all of the affects and all of the intimate links of your daily life. But then when you reach the transcendental state and you've come back, you just want to go back to the world. And you just want to go back and be with your friends and family. And you just want to go back and like, have a burger or something like that. But there's this way in which the fiction, even though it's a fiction, is still an effective fiction. That's my thinking on it.
Yeah, I like that because, less than nothing, more than something, and still it moves. They all have in common this idea that a slip past or a not quite is actually a more basic, simpler state than being something.
Yes.
Right. And that we need to be able to rebuild our philosophies and our sciences and our linguistics and our psychology from the ground up on that observation, rather than just taking being somethings as the fundamental units, because they're not quite fundamental. Not quiteness is a little more fundamental than the units.
Yeah, that's a fantastic way to think about it. I mean, and yeah, I mean that's another new way for me to think about that I haven't yet sort of thought myself. But just to sort of affirm in a sort of symmetrical way with what you were saying about this slip past and not quite. In the first course I was doing in my Hegel lectures, there was one guy in the conversational period of the live, where he was basically articulating like this. He was like in his own moment synthesizing the relationship between Heraclitus and Parmenides, and like trying to reach like he's trying to like freestyle his understanding of the absolute in that moment. And he was like basically getting to this idea of this, like, there's this slipperiness to the absolute. It's just slippery. And he just kept on saying the word slippery. So like, I was just like, that's interesting that came up for you as well. I do think that's it. It's that the two, like the buzzword, like that, I think because Zizek's very complex, but like if he could be boiled down into like buzzwords, it would be like there's this ontological incompleteness, and I think that you're pointing towards that as well. Like the beings are like not quite, like it's not like we shouldn't think about like the atom or even like I don't even like, it's kind of like it's not like the particle or it's like we shouldn't identify with the wave either. It's like we shouldn't identify with the particle or the wave, really. It's kind of like a particle that's not quite, like it's a particle that's not quite a particle, and a human that's not quite a human. It's like it's more like the way to, I think, the way to think about it. And then the consequence of that, and this is like a double move for epistemology and ontology that I like, is like it's epistemological failure and ontological impossibility. Epistemological failure is that you get more and more comfortable with your knowledge structures being wrong, like and that's self-relating negativity, I guess. And then the ontological impossibility is that you can never be a fully perfect being. You're always not quite like, so like back to like, so enjoying our symptom, like, so like for me, like when I'm giving the first example, I think we were pressed record at this point, but like I think when I was describing enjoying my symptom, it was kind of like this idea of there's always this image in my head of like the perfect body. It's like, and it's so devastatingly persistent, like and like it's like this little, I mean, that's like a specter of less than nothing, this like image of the perfect body which is constantly haunting me, and like it prevents me from fully enjoying my symptom, and it puts in all these repressive mechanisms which come in and sort of, you know, and I guess like what's at stake here, if I'm saying like enjoying the symptom, it's not like okay, just binge necessarily, but like, and not, I mean, you could binge, but like not necessarily saying just binge, but it's more saying observe the symptom, observe it, be with it, don't try to block it, and like look at it, be interested in yourself, like be interested in actually the shape of your deviation. That's what I try to do. Like, because I think about like all the ways in which, like, so here's like, let me give you a very personal example of like the battle in my head is like, yeah, like I'll have like this, what I would say is like the repressive mechanism is like, it's like, and I started doing this like in high school really intensely, and it came from feelings like I wasn't enough too. Like, it's like these, I would start to like come up with schedules where like I should go to the gym 6 days a week, and I should eat like this and this, like Monday through Saturday, and like just have like, or like, and I should read this much, this, you know, have this perfect reading week and like this perfect study week, and like all this scheduling, right? All this, and all of that is like almost using the deviation for the perfect image instead of going into the deviation itself and sort of feeling it. Because one of the weird things is like, if you just live in that perfect image and the repressive mechanisms which are setting up the schedule and stuff like that, is like you really shut yourself down. And I mean, or you're never really looking at yourself. You're always deferred somewhere else.
It's very very religious to my ear, right? You're liberating yourself from a false god. I'm sort of thinking about I hang out with Greg Henriquez a lot. So we do a lot of discussion around justification systems. He's got a kind of stratified spectrum of the sciences model where we've got these different zones of applicability, right? There's behavioral investment models describe the psychology of animals, sentient mobile beings, and then a science of justification systems to describe the psychology of sapient narrativized beings in a world of signifiers. And that brings up a couple of interesting things for me. Maybe I'll separate them, right? So the Hegelian idea through Zizek, as I understand it, is that the zero level, the basic form of the realm of signification, of being in a justification system, is not an asserted semantic identity, but rather a determinate negation. He always makes these jokes about, coffee without cream versus coffee without milk. This is an almost nonsensical specification of a particular absence that is used to create a social link and then to collaboratively mobilize justified behavior. And my interest here is that I like to think about the trans-justificatory possibility, the radical forms of spiritual philosophy. And in order to think those, you sort of have to think, how do I get outside of or adjacent to the entire field of signification? And it seems like in order to do that, you need to know what it is that all the usual forms of signification have in common. So if someone was doing Zen or whatever attempt to max out or liberate from the whole set of ordinary significations, it seems like it would be really important for them to deeply know the shape common to all the meanings in the field of meanings. And if what that is the omnipresence of determinate negation in order to get adjacent to the whole justified set of narrative possibilities, then to do the really profound forms of esoteric religion that have been proposed over history, we would have to be able to identify the determinate negation itself as like a very generalized essence of the field of the signifiers. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's basically. I mean, I think I have a few papers which try to point towards just that. But there's basically a what we hold in common is a certain negativity, like what Bard and I will say is like what we hold in common is death, like to put it in a very personal way, like, and all of the different, I mean, it's a determinate negativity, and all of the common shapes of all of the field of signifiers, all of the common shapes in that field of meaning, which I would conceptualize in a Hegelian sense on the layer of the religious idea. When Hegel describes the religious idea in the phenomenology, he doesn't specify one religion. He's talking about he's basically saying that wherever human society developed in history, the society needed a layer of a religious idea, and that would take a certain historical shape. But what is more fundamental than all of those shapes is the determinate negation. That's the level of absolute knowing, and in Hegelian language. And the way I conceptualize it in my head is actually quite kind of similar to the difference in the view of the universe before and after general relativity. Like when we can think black holes or the Big Bang, like basically like all of the matter in the universe is held together by these negative points of reference, the black hole. And like we know that everything's just going to go to the black hole, and everything, and in the far distant stages of the universe, it's just black holes. And then there's then you can go further, but just the idea here is that all of these religions point towards something eternal. And at least in my understanding, what's eternal is this determinate negation, which is necessary because it allows positive substance to become other to itself. It allows change. It doesn't only allow change, but it allows change to change. I think that's even the deeper notion of change. Like there's change. Yes, everything's changing. Like the river, like Heraclitus is changed. Like the river I put my foot in is different than the river I put my foot in yesterday. But even the form of change itself can change. So like for like the example I always give for this is like at one point in the universe, it was just like some soup of plasma. And then at another point in the universe, there were giraffes. Like that's a different form of change, like a totally different form. And like to really think would be to think what would be a form of change that's so different as is different from subatomic particles to giraffes. What would be a form of change that is mind-boggling to think? But that's possible because of determinate negation, because all positive identities are not quite themselves. Like we already covered that slipperiness.
Yeah. Well, if you're following along at home, the constitutive failure mode is the liberating transformative possibility.
No, but
I've got a second question around that I think of as Greg Henriquez versus Hegel, because there's this issue of perspectival framing, right? So if you're going to go, hey, here's pre-signified behavioral psychology, and before that there's matter, and now we're in the realm of justification systems and semantic reality with each other. That sort of, I mean, that's a very compelling story. It's very easy to grasp. It allows us to integrate a lot of knowledge domains, but it pretends that we're in a universal perspective where we can see that happening. And my impression of Hegel, and I don't know if this is correct, but he seems to say, look, no, you're always already in the position of being in this signified zone. Right, that whole notion that there's a non-signified zone is something that appears to you in the signified zone and has significance to you. Right, so, you know, like, but you could push back on that and say, well, look, that's just, you know, you're a left brain obsessed weirdo who can't get out of the representational mode into the actual value of non-conceptual objective reality. Right, that's a compelling argument as well. So where do we come down on this? Like, is taking the signified zone as primary more honest and epistemically humble and sane of what it's like for beings to be in worlds generally? Or is that a zone that we can think outside of and see it as a subset of something?
Yeah, like you guys, like you're giving like I'm loving. I want to like preface my answer with just saying that I appreciate the types of questions you're asking and the types of ways you're seeing this, because it's very helpful for me as well, because I'm realizing more and more actually that like one of the problems I have is what you were saying as being thought of as a left brain representational weirdo, especially like as it relates to like I don't know, like of course like someone like McGilchrist and like this emphasis on the right brain and stuff like this. And I'm not against right brain thinking either. So to your specific question, what you're pointing towards is what Zizek would call the dimension of the big other. So the dimension of the big other is the pretending to have a universal perspective. Like in its simplest way, that's the big other. Like, and the idea is that there's always a subject who will pretend to be the big other. And that there's some necessity, now here's the weird thing. There is some processual necessity to having teachers or masters or figures of knowing. But the big other, in its darker aspect, tries to do something deeper than that. It basically unconsciously tries to be the master or the teacher, or I know, to be like the absolute knowing in the naive sense is I know everything, which is the opposite of what Hegel's talking about with absolute knowing. So this pretending to have the universal perspective, to me, it doesn't really engage with the real of a historical position. It tries to get out of having a historical position. And I think it doesn't understand like specifically like the role of the unconscious. Like to me, what's more important than your conscious justifications are your unconscious justifications. Like, so the unconscious justification systems to me are, and the unconscious justifications following like the Freudo-Lacanian position are linguistic. They're language. Like your unconscious has something to say. It thinks and speaks. That's like the famous like Lacanian notion is like your unconscious thinks and speaks. And like I've had practical examples where like my unconscious is thinking and speaking something in my historical position, which can disrupt my entire life, like very fundamentally. So like I think there's something to be gained by recognizing that you're always already in a historical position. I would say that that's pretty close, and that doesn't bar you from universality, that makes you more universal. You can become the more, and this is the paradox of Hegel's universality for me, is that the more singular you become, the more universal you become. That universality includes within itself singularities. So the big other is kind of like a false universality to me. And that's, I think, like where I think what you're identifying is, I think what you're identifying is the zero level disagreement I have with Greg. Because I've had conversations with Greg, and I've had conversations on the IDW with Greg, and on an unconscious level, there's something that disturbs me in not like, okay, I don't want to say I'm against it. There's something unconsciously that disturbs me about it. I'm not necessarily against it. I'm just saying that I have seen so many people within the university system who propose universal systems, and they don't reflect on the fact that there are a bunch of guys who have universal systems. That's the conversation I would like to hear. I would like to hear a bunch of guys who have universal systems who don't talk to each other. And why don't they talk to each other, and why don't they share each other's languages? And why can't they put them together? And if there really is one language system or one universal system, then I mean, it wouldn't evolve. I wouldn't see the dynamics that I see evolve in the university system, where like what I see in the university system is like competitions between universalities, abstract universalities.
It's I guess my mind's coming back again to the notion of the one, and we've talked about the not quiteness.
Yeah.
We've also talked, or you were just mentioning the way in which something becomes more universal by becoming more particular.
Yeah.
But there's also a sort of, I don't know, I want to kind of the question of the great anus, which is the a-ness, like the quality of being a particular something. Right. And that there's a sort of pragmatic question here, is that when do we count something as operationally behaving as something? It comes up in integral theory a lot because of Wilber's distinction between heaps and holons. Right? A holon exhibits some kind of operational wholeness, and a heap, even though we could call anything a single set, there's a lot of sets that aren't natural sets. Right. You go, well, that's 5 toasters and a toothbrush. It's not really a thing. It's a bunch of things. Right? So, right, we could treat it as a thing. I could put all of them in a sack together, but somehow we want to make a distinction between that and what a thing really is. I had some conversation with Rupert Sheldrake, and he thinks of it in terms of self-organizing systems having sentience and non-self-organizing systems not having sentience, even though they're made up of self-organizing systems. So there's a lot of sort of practical operational dynamic questions here as well. And I wonder how you think about, like, what does it mean to ask the question of when is a one an adequate one? Is that even a question?
Yeah. So like I want to say, like, preface, I have a paper that I wrote for a book within, it's called, the book is called The Practice of Thinking, Cultivating the Extraordinary. And it's with a group of people at the School of Thinking, which I teach at once a month. But the paper is called Self-Development with Dialectics. And the whole paper is about the one and the other. So like I use the concept, the one and the other, and basically try to go through self-development with those concepts as best as I can, inclusive of birth, like becoming a one, and inclusive of maturation of libidinal energy, and being whether you're in the position of basically impregnating the other or being the other who gives birth to a one, and also confronting your determinate negation, the fact that you're going to die. So like that issue of the one, I think, is something that dialectics can speak to. Before I say that, I would, because I don't want to say like I have the final answer to it, is before I say that, I would say that the type of knowledge that points closest to this for me in the sciences was the notion of autopoiesis, because it's this notion of like basically the difference between a cell, like even a simplest single cell, and say like a table or something like that, is like an autopoietic entity will defend its oneness, it'll defend its identity, like it will self-define itself as a one. Now, I don't know if that means I can't really think, or maybe there's a deeper problem of the one before life or before autopoietic processes. But I know in the early autopoietic literature, there were some disagreements between Stafford Beer and the original theorists of autopoiesis, Maturana and Varela, on whether or not autopoiesis as a concept can be extended into the realm of symbolic organization and our human social systems to think about the one. But where I would bring this to the level of Hegel's thought is that the identity is most linked to death. So, and like that's what comes up for me on my spiritual path. Like I'll bring it back to myself. Like what comes up on my spiritual path is my relationship with death, whether that's the way I have encountered and tried to hold the space of the death of my grandfather, whether that's thinking about the metaphorical death of my image, my self-conception, my professional identity, the death of my identity in intimate relationships, and moving through the pain that can come with that, is that I become more and more a singularity. I become more and more myself, although always there's this not quiteness. I become more and more myself the more and more I confront this. And like I would just also give the example of like one of the things that stuck with me when I was a teenager from the movie Fight Club was this scene where Brad Pitt's character Tyler Durden takes a guy from a convenience store back out and puts a gun to his head and says, "What did you want to be when you grew up?" And he said, "I wanted to be a vet." I don't know if you've seen this scene. He said, "I want to be a vet." And he said, "Why aren't you a vet?" And he was like, "Oh, the fees were too high. There's too much things in the way, blah, blah, blah." And he pulled the trigger back and he was like, "If you're not becoming a vet in 2 weeks or something like that, I'm going to come back here and shoot you." And then he let him run away. But it's just this idea that in order to become what you really are, in Nietzsche's sense, to become really your potential, you have to have this confrontation with death, which is kind of like this. It's kind of like something which disturbs your equilibrium.
I mean, it makes me think about the role of the negation in transformation. You know, that guy, Tyler's gun negates the failure of that guy to pursue his own dream. He negates a negation. And then later, of course, Edward Norton negates Tyler's gun by realizing it's in his own hand. You know, it's a very interesting topic. A lot of people, even people who are pretty versed in philosophy, don't go anywhere near the negation of negation. Right? There's a way for a negative to act as an affirmation without ceasing to be a negation by negating itself, so that it's not only not there, it doesn't even get to have its not being there. So it's almost like it's there. I love that.
You know, I watched.
Yeah.
Just very quickly, because exactly what you just said there.
Yeah.
Exactly what I just watched last night, the documentary about the birth of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen that, but the supposed creator of Bitcoin, we don't even know who he is.
Satoshi.
He was the negation of the negation a perfect example of it. He's not only is he not there, but he doesn't even get to have his not being there. And he purposely did that so Bitcoin could become Bitcoin.
That's beautiful. That's I mean, there's such a perfect myth in that creation story.
Yeah.
And
there's an interesting
well, that negativity is not just a concept of absence. It also has a valence, right? It has a role in human affairs, in our dispositions. So I'm curious what you think about the performing of negation in personal terms. Like, if I think, God damn, that Cadell Last is a fucking idiot, right? There's a negativity there, right? So then how do you do Hegelian alchemy on that negativity, on that negation? Like, how do we treat the experience of feeling negative the way we're treating the concept of negation?
I think this is another great question. It's like, it's exactly like, it's not only do you have to learn not only do you have to learn how to love loss, but you have to even lose the loss itself. I don't know if that's too abstract. Like the example that's coming from is like, so the example that's coming from is a deeply personal one. So like, with someone you really loved, someone who let's say your unconscious justification systems said that this person was the one. And you realize that the one you formed has a irreducible negativity. It's constitutive of the relation. Not only do you have to be brave enough to lose the one, but eventually you have to even lose that loss. Now that's possible. That's possible. That's possible in the work of mourning. In the work of mourning, and I just did a lecture on this. So like the work of mourning and the work of melancholia. I think that's what I've been through, to be honest with you. I think I've been through the process of mourning and melancholia. But the thing is that when you're capable of losing and even and I think just by accepting loss, you open up the possibility to lose the loss. And then what happens is that you get a higher order of libido. And I think that that's where you become even more of a singularity than you were originally. So like, if you meet someone who, like, the first thing with self-relating negativity is that if you meet someone and you have a negative disposition towards them, I think the fundamental first thing is that you do the work on the level of self-relation first. You try to figure out what it means about yourself first. And like, and with all of these things, I'm definitely not perfect, but like, I do feel like I have worked through a lot of, I've worked through a lot of this energy as it relates to both like my primal traumas, as it relates to like my father or mother impressions and attachments. Not fully, but like a lot. And like I could say, like, for example, I think the same logic applies to like my relationship with my my doctoral supervisor, where like there was a negativity there between us. And like the pathological consciousness, neurotic, hysterical, manic, is like trying to repeat the impossibility of the one. Like, and you'll see like couples do this too, right? Like couples who are like in toxic relationships or something like that, like they'll just repeat this ridiculous oneness that they hate, but they can't detach from it. You have to be brave enough to lose it. Now that opens up a huge uncertainty. It opens up a huge uncertainty. It opens up a huge unpredictability. It opens up the fact that not only are you going to change, but you have to change the way you change. But I think if you confront it again by being with the deviation instead of covering up the deviation with the examples I was giving of like the repressive mechanisms, but like if you be with the deviation itself and you like basically all that you have to do is like be brave enough to be with yourself, that eventually that loss disappears. And what happens when that loss disappears is like it's possible that you could see that person again. Like it's possible that you could even have a deeper love for them, I think. So I think the negation of the negation opens up the possibility for real love. But I'm just literally freestyling
here. Sounds fantastic. Very inspiring.
No, I know what's at that energy. I know what's at that energy is a very, very deep love. Like, and it's that love that is like, it's that weird thing, right? Like Freud talked about it with like the ambivalence of love and hate, that like you hate and love at the same time type of thing. There's so many songs about that, right? Like I hate to love you, I love to hate you.
I mean, this for some reason makes me think about mysticism. Yeah, one of my routes into thinking about these ideas comes through a distinction between what we might call causal and non-dual mysticism. So causal mysticism sort of traditionally has this overt or cryptomonism, right? An emphasis on eternalized, abstract, unchanging singularities, the self, the void, the one, the absolute, the isness, a concentration in some form of reality as a pure syntactic tautology. It is what it is, exactly and only and endlessly. And non-duality, even though they get confused sometimes, is a little bit different in that it's sort of said, forget about the none or the one. We're dealing with the not two. It's the canceled and uncanceled binary, not the opposite of duality, but the condition under which duality and its opposite are indistinct, or in which non-separateness is in the form of duality. And although that's normally postulated as a form of mystical experience, there's also a kind of logic you can derive from that. And if you apply non-dual logic to causal principles, you end up looking for a simultaneously canceled and non-canceled binary that explains what appears to be a singularity. So that even though you're doing a mystic practice and they say, look, this only this, you just focus on the isness of this. And you go, yes, but isn't this always a this, not that, right? Isn't the isness actually not the regular what is, but the what is of what is? And so it's redoubled. Aren't we dealing with a two here to make this one?
Yeah.
And so in my thinking, that's where I go. And I'm, I guess what I would segue to from that is,
that's interesting. Yeah.
How do we bring those two realms more closely together? How do we make sure that, if people go, yes, I'm all for this high complexity reversal and dialectical unfoldment of the negative, but I want to make sure that we're not losing any of the actual experiences and transformations that our ancestors got through leveraging the naive concept of the one. Like, how do we make sure we get all the benefits of this new, more complicated form of thinking and speaking without losing any of the benefits of the traditional transformative radical experiences? How do we keep those really close together?
Yeah, I love that question. And like that question's also close to my heart too, because like, I mean, I've explored all this, like I've explored like this non-dual consciousness stuff, like as well, like as the philosophy, like I said, like it's weird too, like, because it's like my very, like how our conversation started, like my very openness to Zizek was being stimulated by my ayahuasca experiences, which were my first like real deep psychedelic trips, basically. And like I was just like very open. Yeah, and it's and specifically like psychedelics, but not only psychedelics, like various other spiritual practices have been an important part of my life as well. So I don't think that I don't think that the complex dialectical unfoldment of the negative and the transcendental experiences of the one need to be themselves antagonistic. On the contrary, I think they need each other. I think they need each other, because the biggest criticism of like the way people perceive this dialectic of the negativity and like the people who are sort of like playing around with this thinking is like this feeling of like I think it's because they don't understand the form of thinking, but like there's the spontaneous thought of nihilism, or like there's this spontaneous like confrontation with the concept of the negative and like associating it with like this like first order emptiness or first order not just purposelessness, meaninglessness type of thing. And like on the contrary, I think that that's a shame, because I think really what's at stake in the negation of the negation precisely is the capacity to love in history, in this world, with other people. I think that's what's at stake, and I think that's maybe what attracted me to it. But you know, and then on the other hand, the people who are in like the non-dual transcendental experience space of like people I've like, for example, know quite a few people in that space from my link with Kevin Oros, who I wrote Sex, Masculinity, and God with, and like met other people through that connection, is that oftentimes they have like a naive optimism or like a naive utopianism, which is not bad, but it's also like I've met a lot of people who have come to the idea that they need to complexify their thought. And a lot of people in that space do end up like stumbling into the Stoa and stumbling into like, you know, our circles, broadly speaking. So like, I think that this convergence, or this possible convergence in including both of these is possible, but how to think both is a very attractive idea to try to do. And it's something, and again, it's something that just resonates with me, because all of this to me, I try to keep everything to something that relates to my experience and my personal life, because then it stops me from like getting too far. Like, I mean, we're talking about concepts that you get very lost. So like I try to relate it back to like my experiences of love, or the fact that like, yeah, like I did 5-MeO DMT, and like, what the hell is that?
This is great, because I feel like the, you know, I guess I would, in terms of everything we've been saying so far, I would invite people to stand before the difficulty of that question of how these two things stay really close together.
Yeah.
And not think you had to either choose a practical traditional framing in order to get the experiences, or focus just on the psychophilosophical dimension in the absence of the experience, but really be with the negative, perhaps negative feeling, affect of trying to allow them to simultaneously be what we need.
Yeah. Yeah, like I just would relate it back to, again, like this 5 I had this 2 years ago now. I had this 5-MeO DMT experience, and like,
did you see the self-dribbling machine elves?
that was in that was the with the DMT without the 5-MeO. There was more like this alien encounter, but with the 5-MeO DMT, it was just kind of like within 5 seconds I was gone, basically. And like what was crucial at that moment was letting go and letting it happen. It's again like very much related to this like loss. Like I'm okay to lose everything that I think is me. And then it happened, and it just took over in its overwhelming enormity. And the only like metaphor that I have for the enormity is something like being at the center of a star or a black hole or something like that. Like it's just this enormous thing. But like there's also like the paradox, which I talked a lot about with the people who I was driving there with and back, is that experience doesn't allow you to fully get rid of all of your jealousy. that experience doesn't allow you to fully get rid of your desire for power. That experience doesn't allow you to overcome all of your addictions or something like that. I mean, it can help. Sometimes it can help, and sometimes it actually can't. Sometimes I've seen examples where it doesn't at all, and sometimes it makes it worse. Like I've seen some people have like dramatic ego inflation and stuff like that, or like other things that can happen in a negative dimension. But the overall point is like one I would, and let me use this example because maybe you'll appreciate this. Maybe you're one of the people who would appreciate this in particular. The example I want to give is the relationship between Stan Grof and Freud. So you know Stan Grof? Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've read Stan Grof. Yeah. So the example is like I was watching some documentaries with Stan Grof, and he was talking about how he was originally influenced by Freud and Jung, and he was interested in psychoanalysis. And of course, those disciplines are basically dealing with people who have unconscious, neurotic, hysterical problems, emotional problems related to their day-to-day life. And then he stumbled upon psychedelics, and he started to entertain the hypothesis that the mystical one state basically allowed us to bypass the psychoanalytic work, at least in part. Now, I think the overall method is to combine them. And I think a lot of people are working to try to combine them and somehow, like basically using, for example, mushrooms and combining it with like doing like microdosing and free association. But the overall point for me is that having reached that mystical oneness, that mystical non-dual state, and translating that into everything's good, I don't have to think anymore about complex paradoxes of my intimate reality. That needs to be where things get brought closer together. That would be my intuition of where things need to be brought closer together. And because I think both have their positive and negative side effect, and they could both benefit from each other. That's what I would try to bring together.
I think this has been a terrific conversation. We're at 2 hours of some pretty heavy abstractions, which I find, I mean, it's very arousing if you can stay in the spaces between all the things. It starts to have a very transformative effect. But is there anything else, before we go that I haven't questioned you about, or, anything else you want to add that you've been dying to say?
No, I appreciate
tongue.
No, I appreciate this conversation immensely. I just want to appreciate your role as a questioner and as an interviewer, because you asked some amazing questions. You made some really interesting points. I mean, that genuinely, like there were some ideas you had there which have helped me think about things in a new way, and that's very special to me because it's sometimes very lonely to be me. Sometimes and sometimes it's very, but I think like maybe the last thing I would say is if people are interested in my work, I do a YouTube channel where I basically try to explore some of this complex philosophy. I have a series on the phenomenology of spirit. I have a series on less than nothing, and I'm also doing active workshops on returning to some of Freud's work. And some more stuff in the future. And I've also just launched a website called philosophyportal.online, where I'm trying to develop something like some online courses. So if you're interested in that, check it out.
This has been fun. It's been really nice getting to know you, brother. And I know that loneliness is an issue. I've heard you say on one of your videos, at least one, talking about the role that the support that Patreon provides you in terms of just knowing that people are interested in your work, and the emotional significance of that. So, I want to tell you that I think you're doing excellent thinking, and that you're grappling in all the right areas as far as I'm concerned, and keep going.
Thank you, man. It's been a pleasure.